Welcome to Resolve IBS and IBD Naturally. I'm Courtney Cowie, a nutrition therapy and functional diagnostic nutrition practitioner. If you are struggling with the symptoms of IBS or IBD and want to get to the root cause of your symptoms so you can take back your health through a whole person approach, this podcast is for you. Just a disclaimer that the information I'm presenting in this podcast is for educational purposes only and should not be taken as medical advice. You should always consult a qualified practitioner before making any changes to your health or medical regimen. That being said, let's get on with the show. In episode 4, I want to talk about food sensitivity testing and why I feel you can't resolve gut issues with this type of testing alone. Now, this is a big area I feel currently in the holistic health space because there are companies like Everlywell who are sourcing food sensitivity tests direct to consumer. Other companies are doing this as well. And then on top of that, there are a lot of functional medicine practitioners that are running food sensitivity tests. And not that there's anything wrong with this testing or that functional medicine practitioners are doing this. I myself, even as a functionally trained practitioner, was trained in the mediator release test specifically. And there is a time and place for this testing. Even in my own practice, there are times that I'll run Vibrance gut zoomers or zoomers, food sensitivity zoomers, which look at peptide level reactions, and peptides are even smaller components of food proteins that the immune system can have reactivity to. All of these things can have value. But what I want to make the argument around in this episode is that just doing this alone as the main tool or even the sole tool to try to get to the root of gut issues is not a smart strategy. The other comment I want to make is that I've had many clients who have worked with other functionally trained practitioners that had a very strong emphasis on just running a food sensitivity test, either alongside other tests, maybe blood work, or that was literally the sole strategy that they used to give that client nutritional guidance. And so literally it was running that test, handing them back a list of foods that they should avoid, and sending them out the door. And in my opinion, that is not the way to help a client improve their diet, minimize symptoms, really troubleshoot the things that are irritating their gut and causing chronic inflammation. And I will talk a bit about that as we kind of go through this episode today. So one of the things I want to just say as I've gotten deeper and deeper into my work with clients is that I found more and more people are struggling with lots of layers of hidden stressors, including a good degree of toxicity. And from my perspective, these fall more into the camp of root cause driving factors of almost all chronic illness, but especially gut symptoms. And so, one thing I have to think about when I'm onboarding a client is we have a certain amount available that we are going to be putting towards functional testing. And being a good steward of their testing budget and resources, I have to consider, is it better potentially to run a test or two more that might look at other root cause factors, whether they're toxins or hidden infections or other things that I think might be driving the symptomology that the client is struggling with, or using that money towards a food sensitivity test. And just from my experience, I've actually found that I can get just as good, if not better results with an elimination diet approach than I can compared to food sensitivity testing. And so often I will save that to put towards other testing that I feel will get us a little further in terms of understanding deeper root cause factors. Now, as a nutrition therapy practitioner, which was my original certification and training, I used lots of elimination diets, therapeutic diets, just food journal analysis strategy to help tons and tons of clients get their symptoms better under control, feel better, identify the food triggers that were bothering them. And just because that's so innate to me now, I've been doing it for so long, I've continued to really lean on that as a resource. And I've actually found that this way of working with a client is more productive because it inherently allows me to educate them as I'm looking at what they're eating and, kind of talking through those foods. you can see the light bulbs start to go off as I'm explaining why I believe certain foods might be triggering them. It helps me point them in a different direction, offer comparable substitutes that are higher quality or contain ingredients that are less likely to trigger gut symptoms. That's all I feel lifelong learning that the client is now getting that goes way beyond just running a food sensitivity test, handing a random list of foods to a client and saying, hey, just track your diet and avoid these 10 foods. So that's all I think a much deeper level of trying to teach clients to become competent enough to learn this information. And then after we're done working together, go out and hopefully maintain a high level of health. Are you struggling with chronic diarrhea or constipation and have been told by your doctor that there's either nothing wrong or that you're going to need to take a med for the rest of your life to control symptoms? What if there was another way? A way that empowered you to take back your health through a smart nutritional strategy and through running the right testing to identify true root causes. If you are ready to say yes to self-empowerment and to starting the journey to real improvement in your gut health, click the link to grab my free e-guide. So, one of the biggest limitations to food sensitivity tests, especially for people struggling with cases of IBS or IBD, is that they don't measure for every possible thing a client might be reacting to in a particular food. So, whether that's FODMAPs, and FODMAPs is an acronym that stands for fermentable oligosaccharides, disaccharides, monosaccharides, and polyols. And so there's a specific type of diet called the low FODMAP diet. This is actually a diet I find a lot of conventionally trained GI docs will often point clients to as a starting point. I'll talk about the limitations of that particular diet in more detail down the road. However, there is research showing that avoiding FODMAP foods can be helpful, and it definitely is. And so, that's something to for sure consider in terms of diet. But then there's other components to foods like fiber content, plant toxins, which are especially prevalent in vegetables. So whether these are lectins, phytates, oxalates, alkaloids, there's many different types of plant-based toxins, and these are basically protective components that the plant generates because it allows them to dissuade animals and even humans to a certain extent from being consumed, since plants, unlike living beings, unlike animals and humans, can't run away from predators. They have these components that make them more toxic, if you will, a little bit trickier to digest. And for people who inherently have weakened digestive systems or propensity to developing gut disorders, these components of plants can be quite irritating and problematic if they're consumed in large amounts. So these are all relevant when looking at a client's diet, and these are all components to foods that an IgG or other immune type of food sensitivity test is not necessarily going to give us the data on. So, because of this, I would argue that food sensitivity tests are not considered the gold standard to troubleshooting all potential food reactions that a client might be having, because there's just no way it can cover the gamut of everything in a food that might be troublesome for a client. Now, just speaking from my own experience, being both a patient and a client, working for years with both conventionally and functionally trained practitioners before I became a practitioner myself, I've probably run a good 5 or 6 different food sensitivity tests, different types of food sensitivity tests on myself. Being completely honest, actually, I didn't notice that it got me a whole lot further ahead. I would say during the time I was running those food sensitivity tests, maybe with the exception of the very first test I ran, because this was in the beginning, I wasn't as educated and knowledgeable on diet and elimination diets as I am today. But during the rest of the time, I was adding in those food sensitivity tests to get more clarity and clearance, or clarity on my foods that I was reacting to. I found that eliminating those specific foods on top of running the particular, elimination diet I was running didn't necessarily move the needle a whole lot for me. So, I just personally haven't had a real wow effect with these tests. And I think, like most practitioners, what we personally trial and experiment with and find to be relevant and true for us will often shape the way that we work with our clients and help us, direct them a certain way. Because of course, if something isn't working well and we're dealing with a specific symptom picture or condition, we certainly aren't going to use a tool that doesn't work for us as, a client or a patient with our own clients as a practitioner. So I just want to kind of put that out there. And again, just want to circle back to the point that I've seen time and time again in my work with clients, very, very good results just using elimination diets, therapeutic diets right out of the gate to help them feel better. And often, as I mentioned in earlier episodes, getting this dialed in is the factor that can really help move the needle in the beginning for somebody struggling with IBS or IBD. The other problem that I just want to speak to with regards to focusing on food sensitivity testing as a primary test or the sole test is that it can often lead to a never-ending cycle of more and more food sensitivity testing. And so what I've seen with many clients who have worked with someone else or tried to troubleshoot this on their own before they've come to work with me is that they've run an initial food sensitivity test, they've avoided the foods that came up in that test. Then, 3 months, 4 months, 5 months, 6 months go by, they run a second test. Now they've got a new list of foods they have to avoid. So now they're switching up their diet and they're focusing on this new list of foods. And then again, months go by, they repeat that test. It's another list of foods. And this can go on and on and on. And so, to this end, I feel like on some level, it's impossible to have zero reactivity to any and every food. I've just never seen that. And I've looked at a ton of food sensitivity tests, even, just in my consulting work, looking at my fellow colleagues testing that they're running on their clients. I just have never seen a food sensitivity test that is completely clean for any person. And by definition, the more we consume a food, the more the immune system could potentially be picking that up as a foreign system, a foreign substance that it could be mounting a reaction to. I mean, there is the reality that overconsumption of foods will raise the likelihood of having a higher degree of immune reactivity to those specific foods. This also kind of depends on how permeable the gut barrier is, which is a topic for another day. But just in my experience, I don't find that running food sensitivity testing ever yields an end result where a client gets rid of all of their food sensitivities. I've just not seen that. And so it can literally put someone on this roller coaster of endless food sensitivity testing and then eventual frustration because they feel like they're maybe regaining tolerance to certain foods, but now they're intolerant to a whole new batch of foods. And this just never ends. And so they get used to walking around in the world afraid of, at any given time, 10 to 15 foods, and then having to carry a little list of foods so that they can remember if they're at a restaurant, okay, I can't eat lettuce or I can't eat apples or whatever it is, right? And they're having to constantly keep these things in mind. And that gets stressful, and it just, I think over time wears a person down, and it ultimately isn't getting to the root of what's driving these food sensitivities in the first place. And that's really the crux of my argument with today's episode, is that this is the biggest limitation of food sensitivity testing. It doesn't identify the root or root cause factors that are driving these food sensitivities in the first place. They're helpful for identifying burden foods and taking those away to lessen the load, the inflammatory load. But that's about as far as food sensitivity will go, in my opinion. Now, I do want to just mention that from an elimination diet standpoint, I have found it to be true that, especially with clients struggling with long-term gut symptoms and or they've had diagnoses of IBS or IBD, for the most part, it is true that they would generally do best avoiding certain inflammatory foods for the long haul. It's not super common that I found, especially with people struggling with gut conditions, that they're able to regain tolerance to just about every single food out there under the sun. Is it possible? It is possible, but I tend to find that these are people that inherently also have genetic potentials that make them more sensitive to certain types of foods. And as their body and their health has had some degree of breakdown, now the immune system gets triggered. it can be problematic even after we do a certain degree of gut rebalancing and the gut is in a healthier place for them to be able to actually tolerate those foods. The reality is sometimes the immune system is always going to have an alert or, have a reaction to some of these foods, no matter what, going forward. And so it just becomes then the client's choice and experience to decide, how diligent they want to be with avoiding certain trigger foods to keep feeling their best for the long haul. And that's everyone's kind of own personal experience and choice. And I've generally found that with the majority of clients I've worked with, they've noticed they're feeling so much better with all of the changes that they're making over the 3 to 4 months we work together, that they actually get to a place where they decide, what, it's actually, I'd rather give up these few foods as much as I possibly can because I feel so much better that it's not worth it to me to eat these things on the regular and then constantly be struggling with these symptoms coming back. So, that's kind of the benefit of, I think, empirically experimenting and trialing different dietary approaches and seeing what actually is working, what is actually helping a person to feel better. So the other thing I want to say is that the biggest problem with running food sensitivity testing to reduce gut symptoms is that it just isn't going to identify the deeper root cause issues driving these food sensitivities. And the point I'm really making here is that there always are deeper root cause issues driving these food sensitivities. And if you're not considering that, if you're trying to troubleshoot this on your own, or you're working with a practitioner that isn't looking at deeper root cause issues beyond just food sensitivity testing, there's a big chunk of the picture being missed, in my opinion. To really regain food tolerance, you definitely need to address these root cause issues so that these stressors can be dealt with and removed from the picture, which will theoretically allow gut function to come back online, the health of the microbiome to improve. And then that in and of itself will improve tolerance to foods and reduce the type of food sensitivities and the number of food sensitivities a person is having. This strategy, in my opinion, also eliminates the need to have a client constantly retesting for food sensitivities and then navigating these lists of foods for the long haul. We really don't want to be stuck in that type of cycle at all. Like in my practice, I don't even consider that an option. And right out of the gate, we're not even going to deal with that because it does, I find with dietary approaches, if we're making logical changes to the diet, often these are things that we're doing in small steps that a client can handle. It's not like an overwhelm of change to where they're going to have to carry a list of foods to remember what to avoid. That can get very burdensome, in my opinion. So, if I'm walking a client through positive dietary change, typically I'm doing this in a way that feels doable, that feels like their brain can kind of handle one chunk at a time, so that they're literally kind of learning and almost in a sense memorizing where they're going and what they're trying to do, so that it doesn't have to become this extra, chore, if you will, that they have to remember and, keep track of when they're, out with friends or grocery shopping or what have you, looking at labels and trying to decide, oh my gosh, is there something in here I can't have? I find that trying to make this a more seamless, intuitive, logical process works the best for the majority of people. And the biggest thing really with food reactivities and food sensitivities is that in a true workable, functional plan for any one given client, I feel like there needs to be some sort of endpoint to the process, right? Like you're mapping out a plan. There is a reality that sometimes it can take longer to get to the end of that road than what you initially project. But the point is there should be this start and finish point that we're generally shooting for, right? And that finish point should look like, for most people, less food reactivity, greater food tolerance, the ability to handle more foods without issues, and just generally a less dysfunctional, less symptomatic gut. So to that end, there really is no need to continually repeat food sensitivity test. If you run a test in the beginning to get a good baseline read on what's going on, that's fine. But it's really that cycle of endless testing that I'm trying to caution both regular people out there against, but also just kind of impart to you that if you're working with a practitioner that's really hyper-focused on that, they're likely missing a big part of your overall picture. Before closing out this episode, I just want to make a quick correction. So earlier I had mentioned that there are plant toxins in vegetables, which is definitely the case, but I also want to mention that plant toxins are found in grains, legumes, seeds, and nuts to a certain extent as well. Did you find this episode informative and helpful? I'd love to have you leave me a 5-star rating. Do you have questions about holistic approaches to optimizing gut health that you'd like to ask? Please leave your question or comment below, and I will be sure to address it personally or cover it in a future episode. Be sure to check the show notes for any resources mentioned in today's episode. See you next time.